All right, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome to everyone, whether you're in the room here or joining us by Zoom online. I just wanted to take a moment here at the beginning. My name is Eric Fry-Martin. I'm the Director for Constituent Engagement at Mennonite Mission Network. This is a collaboration of Mennonite Mission Network, Mennonite Church USA, and Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. I think each of those organizations are interested in different ways in connecting with pastors and leaders and congregations, and interested in finding ways to do more things like this to resource pastors and leaders and congregations. And so if you all have ideas for how we can be doing that, we are certainly interested in that. And I will let Allan come up and introduce himself how he would like to. On the promotional materials was all his resume. So you all know that he's well qualified. And so I'll let him say anything he wants to add to that. But thank you, Allan, for being here and sharing with us.
Thank you, Eric. It's great to be here online and to be here in person. This was a conversation that Eric and I were having a few months ago about preaching and so on. And eventually he invited me to come do something on preaching. And so what I've chosen to work with this time is, what is your sermon doing? This question has been with me for decades. I was a pastor for 16 years or so mostly in Canada, mostly in Ontario. And it was after I was a pastor for many years that I decided to go do a PhD in homiletics. I was noticing some things about Mennonite sermons that bothered me. And I realized that I just loved preaching in so many different ways. So I decided to go to the Toronto School of Theology and complete a doctoral degree in preaching, homiletics. I've been at AMBS. This is the beginning of my 13th, or is it my 14th year? It's been a long time. And just so you know, AMBS, I came in 2011, the entire administration, with the exception of one or two people, and the entire teaching faculty has all changed since I came. And I am now the second oldest professor at AMBS. There's one who's a bit older than me. I won't mention her name. Rachel Miller-Jacobs, not her real name, but she's just 2 years older than me. And but I remember as a child looking at all these, or a teenager looking at the catalogs of AMBS, and my uncle went there, and I was thinking, oh my goodness, what a great place to study. And then seeing all the old men who were teaching there, and now I'm one of them. So I did take a look at I thank you very much for those of you who, and most of you did, include something about what your sort of burning issues or questions are about preaching. I may not be able to cover all of those. In fact, I probably can't. But there were numerous things that were mentioned. Some of them had to do with sermon process. How do I get from, Tuesday to Sunday? What's the process that I can? How can I be aware of my process, and how can I maybe improve that process and even make it more efficient? Other folks talked about the communication of the gospel, of preaching, the delivery of the sermon, that kind of thing. A few people said they were coming to this because it was free. Others had, some of you are guest preachers, and that's an issue for you. You're preaching in different churches on behalf of MCC or MCUSA or MC Canada. There are a few Canadians here, by the way, online. And there was also questions about vulnerability in the pulpit. How much do I reveal about myself? How much do I give testimony to something from my own life? And when does that become too much information, right? What happens when I overshare, right? There were a few other things that I can't quite recall right now, but I did study those last night as I prepared for this and yesterday, so that I hope I can't fulfill all the expectations, but I hope that in some way this particular topic, what the sermon is doing, will be helpful for all of you. So just a basic kind of outline of what I'm getting at here, and that is that we get the question a lot, what's your sermon about this week? I think, and the about question is good, and I know I'm saying about like a Canadian does. The about question is good. It's about nouns, right? It's when my sermon is about discipleship this week, or it's about Jesus healing, or it's about Abraham and Sarah, and when the strangers come and tell them they're going to have a baby. So that's what the sermon is about, or it can be about forgiveness, or so on. There's a topic there, a noun. But I'm also interested in this question of what your sermon is doing, and now we enter into the world of verbs, right? So I have a number of things here on the PowerPoint, and these are just sample ideas. This is not exhaustive at all. When you think about a particular sermon that you have preached or will preach, is this sermon meant to comfort? Is that the main verb you would use for this sermon? Is it there to challenge? Do you want this sermon to build up the church or build up individuals? Do you want this sermon to draw us closer to Christ or to each other? Is this sermon a moment of celebration of something? Do you want to lead people to love themselves, love God? Maybe this sermon is there to remind people of remind the church of something. It could be that you want to invite a decision to follow Jesus. Maybe this sermon is meant for people to respond to Christ in some way, or God. Maybe it's there to point to the marginalized in our community. Maybe this sermon is there to inspire the congregation to discipleship. This is not a complete list. You can think of many other, this is the world of verbs and participles, right? What is your sermon doing? And often with my students at AMBS, I give them one. This sermon that you're preaching, what is it doing? Is it meant to comfort? Is it meant as a call to discipleship? Is it meant to inspire or evoke? And then you can start playing with some of those verbs. What's the difference between inspiring, invoking, or provoking? Those are all different verbs with different characteristics. So this is what we're driving towards in this question, what is your sermon doing? One of the ways that we can kind of grab onto this concept is if we think of specific events in the life of the church. So a funeral, well, what is my sermon doing at a funeral? Well, you can fill in the verbs. It's meant to comfort the grieving. One of the things it may also be doing is assuring us that the deceased is now in the hands of God. So assurance of salvation. I've been to some funerals where what the preacher was doing with the funeral sermon was trying to evangelize the rest of us. I didn't like that. I thought that was inappropriate for this given occasion. In a similar way, weddings, what is this sermon doing, right? It's there to perhaps encourage the couple to keep loving each other after the honeymoon is over and keep working together. But again, I've gone to weddings and I've heard sermons that really are disconnected to what the moment is. And you can translate that into other kinds of moments. What is a Christmas? What's Christmas? What's Easter? And what kinds of things are we going to do in those moments? But one of the things that's left up to our decisions is sort of the rest of the year, right? You're preaching in some, generic Sunday in October, or in April, or in June. And it's not a particular event. It's not a baptism, it's not communion, and it's just your average Sunday. And then you have some decisions to make about what this sermon is actually doing in this moment. And we're going to get more to the doing of this, how we do the doing as we progress today. My dream, and what I hope to inspire my students to do, is to make the sermon a happening of the gospel. It's an event. It's a moment. Something is happening. God is doing something mighty that may not be mighty. It may be really subtle. God is doing something in our worship and in our preaching. Doing something. And this seminar is meant to start to explore that. I have this dream that, so let's say you attended church, but somebody in your family didn't. You go home, and they might ask, what was the sermon about this week? Interesting. But you wouldn't ask that question if Billy, if you went to the symphony or to a rock concert or something. You came home, your wife wouldn't ask you, so what was the concert about? Right? It would be more, what was that like? What was the experience like? And so what I'm aiming for is experiential sermons, that we can write and ponder and create sermons that are an experience. Not simply an event, not simply a moment of teaching. We're going to talk about that. Sermons always do teach. We're always teaching something. But the sermon can do so much more than that. Joined to the teaching that we're doing, something else can also happen along the way. Here's our agenda for today. I want to look at an ancient model for public speech. And then we're going to do, I'm going to talk, the bulk of the first part of this will be sermon focus. And I have a mnemonic device for this. The tiny dog now is mine. We're going to get to that cute little dog in a few minutes. It really is a sermon focus thing. And then probably about halfway through this whole thing, I want to lead us in some vocal body exercises that will help us do the sermon. The voice is a full body instrument. Voice is not just here. And we're going to do some exercises that will enliven our voices so that we hear you preach, and not some idea of what you think preaching should sound like. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about sermon form, and then next steps. And for those of you, there will be times in the room here when I'll ask if you have any questions and so on, or have any comments. And also if you're on Zoom, feel free to put some questions in the chat. I don't know how we're going to wrestle with all of those as time goes on, but maybe I'll respond to some of those things after this session is over. Aristotle and public speaking. So we're going way back to 400 years before Christ. Aristotle and many other philosophers of the day were pondering the most effective way to speak publicly. And they're not obviously talking about sermons, although there may have been a few rabbis hanging around, I don't know. But They're talking about the speeches that are made in law and public speeches and in politics, mainly. And there are three things that Aristotle mentions that are important in public speaking. One of them is logos. Logos is word or information or argument. Every good presentation has some information, and it will be presented in a kind of logical way. Logic being, of course, fairly loose. There are many different kinds of logic that one can use, but there's a kind of argument there. You're going to start here, go here, and go here. As a lawyer or as a politician or as somebody who is just simply addressing their community. The other part of this is pathos. So emotion. How is the person who is speaking, how are they engaging the emotions of the people who are present, as well as their own emotions? And this doesn't mean over the top, emotional, dramatic. It could, right? In a court of law or in a political speech, you can do some of those kinds of things, but it's not limited to those big moments. It is feeling. What do you feel about this in your gut? And how is that coming across in your argument, the logos, right? How do you appeal to emotion, appeal to people's stories in the process of this speech? The other thing is, the third thing is ethos. So this is a word that often we can translate into ethics. And it is ethics if it's this bigger concept of ethics, ethos. This is who you are. Before you even stand up to do a public speech of any kind, Aristotle is saying you have a reputation, right? You are a person known in the community or known as a leader or as a community leader, as a lawyer, as a politician, and that goes with you. It is embodied in you when you speak. And if people have great respect for you, they will listen to you in a different way. If people do not like you, that's going to be a problem, right? Or if they don't know you, or if they've heard bad things about you. But of course, the positive part of this is that you bring your whole self into this argument. And this is the place where Aristotle would notice that somebody, a politician, is making an argument for something and even has their emotions into it, but this person has a bad reputation. They're actually talking in a way that is the opposite of how they act. So it's not as credible. So these three things, logos, pathos, ethos. And if you're thinking these are like totally ancient things that don't matter anymore, I see people shaking their heads. No, this doesn't matter. There was a study done, I think it could be more than 10 years ago now, by a number of scholars of preaching. I think they got a big Lilly grant or something, you know how it is. It's called Listening to the Listeners. And if you want to find, they actually published 4 books. You only have to buy one, which is the summary of it. But if you want all the details, go ahead and buy all 4. It's edited by Ronald Allan. I've got some names up there for you if you want to track that down. Of course, just put that into Google and you'll find them. And they found something really interesting when they asked 263 people about preaching. And these 263 people were from broad denominations, including Mennonite and Anabaptist denominations, Catholics, Protestants, all over North America, and I think into Canada a little bit. And they were interested in how a sermon is heard and what makes a good sermon. And they found something that they weren't even looking for. They found that there's sort of 3 kinds of listeners out there. The first kind of listener just wants the facts, Jack, right? Like they like a very organized sermon. They're probably more into the logos of everything. They want information. They want teaching. They may want sort of 3 easy steps I can follow this week to improve my marriage or to be a better Christian, that kind of thing, right? And then there's the people who love the stories. Oh, I love the stories the preacher tells. So this is closer to emotion. Stories are emotional trips. They are emotional journeys, right? There's a problem, and then there's some complexity, and then there's, a solution, right? So stories from the Bible, stories from the preacher's life, these are all a part of this group. They love the stories, right? So you have these people who love the propositional sermon, just the facts, and they love and then there's another group that loves the stories. And they found something really interesting, and that is all of these 2 groups, there's a lot of overlap with the third category, which is we listen to the preacher because we respect the preacher. This preacher, this pastor, was with us when our mother died and walked us through the whole process and has helped us with our grieving, did the funeral. This person has integrity. We know that from her work in administration, her work with the community, and so on. So even if people aren't attuned to your style of preaching or the style of a sermon, they will listen because they love you. Love may be a strong word. They may not, it really has a lot more to do with respect and integrity. The love could be there too. Yeah. So this is just a little something to get us moving on this whole idea that the sermon is doing something. In the same way that a political speech is doing something, they have an end goal. And the lawyer speaking in front of the jury or the judge, they have a goal. It isn't just information. There is emotion connected to it. And as a lawyer or a politician, they have a reputation that is or maybe not be or is not behind what they're saying. Actually, I'm going to pause for a minute. Are there any questions so far or comments? And I'm happy to, if somebody says something, I'll repeat the question or comment. Yeah, a comment, okay. Yes. Yes. You have answered your own question. Yes. So, yeah, the guest preacher is at a disadvantage in the area of ethos. Maybe. Like, I mean, a lot of you who are going out and preaching with MCC or MCUSA or another organization, you do have some cred because you're Mennonite famous, right? We may have seen you in the Mennonite or some other publication like the Anabaptist World Review or something like that, or the kind of pamphlets that you get at your church, so on. So you may have that kind of credibility already, but certainly the institution itself, you're carrying that with you as you come to that setting, right? But that is, for those of you who are guest preachers, that is something to ponder and think about, is the integrity, and then how do you try to build that integrity into what you're saying that morning. I think we'll just move on. There'll be other times for questions. Okay. Here is kind of the meat of what I want to say today. Sermon focus is exceedingly important, and you can see all the words there. I decided not to hide everything, and just go line by line, so that you can see it all, and I'm going to treat each of these as we go. The Tiny Dog Now Is Mine is a mnemonic device from Paul Scott Wilson, the 4 pages of the sermon. You can find that book just about anywhere. There's a revised version that he made recently. He was my Dr. Father. He was the person who was my main mentor in preaching at the Toronto School of Theology. And, homiletics professors and lots of other professors, they don't just invent things. They're pulling out things that they've seen and heard from elsewhere and maybe organizing it in a bit of a different way. So a lot of these concepts here have been written about before, but this is sort of the way that Paul put them together. And of course, he put it together in a way that you can remember it. The tiny dog now is mine. So let's launch into this. As you can see, it's all about one. There was a time when in preaching, we thought a lot about threes. 3-point sermon. How can I say this in 3 different ways, or how can I outline 3 different kinds of things? In the last 40 years, I'd say, the emphasis has been more on one. What's this one thing that this 10-minute or 20-minute or 30-minute sermon will focus on and do? So the beginning of this, and remember I teach at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, is one text. It is really confusing. I'm going to say this and then I'm going to back away from it. It is confusing and hard for us to hear when a sermon has a lot of different biblical texts. We're literally going from Ezekiel to Daniel to John to Revelation in an apocalyptic sermon. And it's really hard to keep track of all of that. It can be done. I typically don't teach topical sermons, and that's what a topical sermon would be. It's like I have a topic like forgiveness or the end of time or something like that. And then you start building in these different biblical texts. One of the problems of that is that you don't have a lot of time to dive into all of those texts in a deep way. And I know that for some, if you're preaching from a lectionary, there are 4 different texts. One of the really interesting things that I discovered about the lectionary just only a few years ago is that some of those, if you're trying to weave together those 4 texts in some way in your sermon, that can be problematic. It can work, but it's also, those texts weren't necessarily meant to go together. Right? Even those who set up the lectionary weren't necessarily thinking that there's a through line in this. Some of them make sense, and some of them don't. Our sermons are more focused if there's one text. So even if you come up with a really cool idea, I want to preach about forgiveness and I want to preach about it this way, and then you go find a text, that's okay. But you still need to do the homework on that text, right? So it does start with a biblical text. One text. And there is so much in one biblical text. And a biblical text it can be anywhere from 3 verses to 20, maybe, or something like that. But it's a unit of text. It might be a story. It might be some unit that Paul writes in one of his letters. It could be a section of law in the Old Testament. But there are these units and sections. And it really helps the sermon focus if you, as the preacher, and the congregation can go through this one text. And you can go through it with some depth if you're working only with one text. One text, one theme. So the way the mnemonic works, if you haven't noticed, the tiny dog now, so 2 T's and a D and an N and an I and an M. So the refers to one text, tiny refers to one theme. As you're working on this text and thinking about the context and thinking about other things, what is the theme that leaps out at you for this text? And I have my students, it has to be a 7-word sentence or less. A theme is very short. And a theme isn't necessarily the title of your sermon. That might be giving too much away. And a theme is maybe something that you don't even say out loud. It is something for you to work on and then to have in front of you as the week progresses. So a theme can be as simple as, if I'm using the story from Luke about the woman who was bent over and lifted up by Jesus, Jesus lifts us up. There you go. There's a whole bunch of other things happening in that text, but I'm narrowing it down to one movement, one moment of the gospel, one theme that can carry its way through the whole sermon. Anna Carter Florence, and I recommend any of her books or essays. She's a teacher at Columbia Seminary in Atlanta, Georgia, and she's an evocative writer. Her books on preaching or on biblical interpretation, the way she uses language is how she preaches. It just leaps off the page in a very in a beautiful way and in a provoking kind of way. She says that sometimes when we're searching for the theme, the thing we're going to really preach about, and the thing we're really going to do in the sermon, she says there's going to be a moment in your study when you're studying the text and you're thinking about life, and maybe you've taken a break and you come back, and you're going to think this thought. It's something you could do with this sermon. And then you think to yourself, can I really say that? Can I really say that in a sermon in this church on Sunday? And she says, too often we ignore that. It's too dangerous. It's too controversial. It's too, whoa. It questions so much of biblical authority, and it questions all the beliefs that we have. Can I really say this? And she says, stay with that for a while. Don't just ignore that aha that you have, because you know your people, you know the text, you're getting to know the text. And yeah, that thing may seem a little dangerous, but follow that up. And that may not be the thing. You may decide, well, no, that's not it, but ooh, there's this other thing. Yeah, I can say that. Right? But so stay with, meditate with, pray over that first dangerous idea that you had. So one text, one theme, and dog, the tiny dog, refers to doctrine. So as you're working on the text, as you're working on the theme, and sort of trying to settle on a theme, what's the main theological or faith topic that this sermon is working on? Is this sermon about salvation? Is this sermon about the Lord's Supper? Is this about forgiveness? Is this about confession? Is this about prayer? Right? And one of those, right? A sermon that's about confession and prayer and communion and all kinds of things will be confusing. And eschatology, right? Throw that in there too. That's too much for us to hear in one 10 or 20 minute moment. What's one theological issue? And you can look through the Confession of Faith and a Mennonite perspective for some of those categories. Your systematic theology textbook that you haven't looked at for 20 years. There you go. There's all those topics: God, Jesus, creation. They're all there. Is this creation? Is that what I'm preaching this week? Is that where I'm going? And this affords you the opportunity, if you can narrow this down, to do a little bit of reading that week on creation or forgiveness. Maybe it's an internet search. Maybe you have chapters in your library that you can look at on, and just read a few pages again. Remind yourself of this doctrine, this aspect of theology. The tiny dog. So now you have a biblical text, you're working on a theme, you're trying to suss out the doctrine of this sermon. And then the N, the tiny dog, now, has to do with need. And sometimes if my students don't quite understand this, they send their information back to me and say, the people need Jesus. Yeah, okay, we know that, yeah. Or the people need the gospel. Yeah, good. This is a little bit different than that. It's what is the deep human need that is at the bottom, at the core of this sermon. And this sometimes can be answered by what's the problem that you're working through? What's the human sin or wound or condition or conflict that is at the bottom of this sermon for which you will preach the good news at some point? And the needs, so there are needs or longings, and this could be connected, of course, with the purposes of preaching or what the sermon is doing. This is an intimate way to look at those things, right? These people need to grieve, right? This is a place where people are grieving. That gives me some clues as to what kind of comfort I will preach in my sermon, right? The need space is also the space to say that generally you can't preach to everybody all the time. So we have a miraculous thing in most of our churches, and that is we have an intergenerational reality. Intergenerational, we have people from many walks of life, maybe even many ethnicities, and we're collecting them in this place, and they come generally every Sunday morning. And it is really hard to preach a sermon that will be equally heard by 7-year-olds and a 70-year-old executive for an oil company and a frustrated mother at home who would rather be working somewhere else, right? That's really difficult. So one of the things with need is it could be that this sermon, well, what's this sermon doing? It could be this sermon this week is going to be for those who are struggling with their marriages. And everybody else gets to listen in. It could be that this sermon, again, depending on what biblical text you're using, what theme you're choosing, it could be that this sermon focuses on seekers, those who in the church who may want to make a decision for Christ soon, right? It could be for those who are already mature Christians. And you can keep listing off the kind of human conditions that we find ourselves in. It's really hard, again, to preach a sermon that everybody is going to listen to. So who are the listeners of this particular sermon? And everybody else gets to listen in. This is how I do wedding sermons, for instance. The sermon is really for the couple. And everybody else gets to listen in and will benefit from it, I hope. Or maybe not. And for a funeral, well, it's for close friends and family, and everybody else gets to listen in, right? So the need issue is a highly contextual thing, right? This is really about this part of the church or that part of the church. And of course, there are sermons that will appeal to just about everybody. But again, it's really helpful to be focused in who this sermon is directed to. And it's not like you're gonna, point people out. This sermon is for you. Joe, I've seen some issues in your life and I really want to hit you on the head with this one. No, it's not that. But it is, those who are going through specific kinds of trauma, or those who are facing uncertainties in their jobs and so on. So there's all these different needs in the congregation, and you as a pastor know what those needs are. And if you don't know exactly the needs, if you're a guest preacher, well, most of us can guess the human condition, right? We require belonging. We like belonging. We like food. We like all kinds of things. And we have a lot of crap happen to us along the way. And we often have to go with plan B. I mean, you can sort of list out those generic kind of human longings and needs and so on. One image. One. It's really easy. It's a lot easier to listen to a sermon that has one main image in it. And I'm not talking about images on a screen necessarily, although that may be included. I don't use images on a screen generally, except for this. But our stories can create images in the minds of the listeners. So what is the main image of this particular biblical text and the theme? So again, with my sermon on the woman who was bent over and then Jesus uncurved her, the image is that. The image is right. And I can demonstrate that beside the pulpit, but I can keep referring to that. Jesus lifted her up. Now she can see the world and she can use her hands and all kinds of things like that. An image may come from the biblical text itself. Maybe it's the embrace of two people who were once at odds and are now reconciled. The image can come from something that you saw in the world this week. The image can come from so many different places, but what's an image that you can keep going back to in your sermon, however the sermon is moving? I'll give you two examples. One of our students was a preacher at St. James AME Church here in Elkhart some years ago. And she preached a sermon and it had an image, but it was also a rhetorical line. And that was, Abraham and Sarah, they're not going to have a baby. They're not going to have a baby. And this line kept going through the whole sermon. And she talked about the biblical text. They weren't going to have a baby. And then she talked about the story of the strangers who come and tell them, but they're not going to have a baby. And then she talked about the city of Elkhart and some really hard things that are happening. And she didn't say, but that's not going to work in Elkhart. She could have, but she said, Sarah and Abraham, they're not going to have a baby, because you get it. You get the connection, right? And it was only at the very end where she said, Abraham and Sarah had a baby. And then she sat down, right? As listeners of a sermon, it's a great gift to hear. We need to go back. We're not reading. Reading and listening are very different experiences. So to go back to a kind of a home or anchor image of some kind, and the image can change. It can change from being bent over to coming up, but it's still a part of that same image. Another sermon that I recall would be Cleophas LaRue, who preached at AMBS Pastors Week 2011, and his sermon, which he's done many times, no notes, there he is. And it's the story of Paul going to Athens and preaching from Acts, right? Acts 17, thank you. There's somebody who's biblical here, I like that. And Yeah. He started with this thing and ended with it. There's no room for the gospel in Athens, right? And so he talks about Paul going to Athens, and only a few people listened. There's no room for the gospel in Athens. And then he talked about some other movements in history, but there's no room. And he talked about other places, but he kept saying, there's no room for the gospel in Athens. And he started talking about our churches in the Mennonite world and generally the Christian world in the United States. And he said, there's no room for the gospel in Athens. He could have said, there's no room for the gospel in your church, but no, he kept it with, there's no room for gospel in Athens. And he actually ended with that line too. And now it becomes a kind of sarcasm, right? And you just want to say, oh, yes, right? So what's the image? What's the main image that you're in your sermon? And it can be a rhetorical line that often evokes a kind of image. Another cautious word about image, and that is that you don't want, I'm going to say this negatively. You don't want a superfluous image to take over. If I start my sermon, and there are people who do this, by saying, yeah, so I was traveling, from New Orleans to Chicago on a plane, and this was several years ago, and I was sitting beside a lovely man who we started talking, and he's African-American, he's from Chicago, and said his name was Barack Obama, and we had this great conversation. Yeah. You tell that story? This didn't happen to me, by the way. But people tell stories like that. But now you're going to think it did. But people tell stories like that. First of all, that's just shameless name dropping, right? Don't do it. I said that, didn't I? And the thing is, that image will take over. You really can't use another image throughout that's going to be more powerful than that. Right? That's just one kind of story, the meeting a celebrity story. Another kind of image, we have to be really cautious about violent images in our sermons. And this is a judgment call, because one of the troubles we have in this world is violence, sexual violence, physical violence, war. These are awful, awful things, and they're graphic. Can be. But to use that in a gratuitous, superfluous way will take over the sermon. So one way of approaching that is to be more ambiguous about the violence, and then have an even larger image about the kind of reconciliation that could happen in that situation. Images. So again, I don't need images on a screen. I'm of the belief that we can create them in our words. And the last one, which we can't see very well here, and I'm not going to even try to adjust it because then it'll mess everything up, is one mission. One. What is one thing that you can talk to us about in your sermon this week, this sermon, about how we can live into our lives of discipleship? One of the reasons that I studied homiletics as an Anabaptist Mennonite was because I was hearing far too many sermons that had at least 10 of these in a sermon, right? Here's how to follow Jesus. You do this, you do this, you do this. It's almost a shotgun approach, right? Violent image. But one thing. What is one thing that you can encourage us with, inspire us to do? And maybe the one thing is something we're already doing. Maybe the soup kitchen that the church is in charge of, that's the thing mentioned this Sunday, and then something else next Sunday. There are a few essays on this from Stanley Hauerwas, Charles Campbell. I can get you a little bit bibliography to send out afterwards. they talk about daring to do one thing as a church, in a sermon, and so on. We don't need big lists of things to do. As soon as you start giving out a lot of lists of things to do without the empowerment to do them, then we're left going home thinking that the church, that being a Christian is all about doing all of these things. And in a sense, it is. But having one mission or one moment of discipleship, one aspect of discipleship rather than 8 of them, really helps to focus the sermon. I'm going to go back to doctrine for a minute because I forgot something. Look over your sermons because you have so much time to do that, I know. And note that your favorite theology often comes through, right? One of my friends said to me once, is an older, wise gentleman of the church who said, I think all of us just have 5 sermons. Really? And there could be something true about that. So watch out or be aware as you're putting your sermon together that maybe you preach mostly creation and discipleship and community. And notice that this sermon may take you somewhere else to a different theological category than you're used to. And you get to live with being uncomfortable with that, right? And if you're struggling with that, the congregation will be struggling along with you, perhaps. But be open to these other categories of doctrine or faith that the text and the theme lead you toward. Another thing with this, I'd say this in a broader ecumenical setting, is that, kind of interesting how the Presbyterians always end up with God's sovereignty. The Catholics are always pointing to the Eucharist. And the Mennonites are preaching another sermon on how to be good. And the Pentecostals are going to end with the Spirit and so on. Again, watch the denominational inevitability. This sermon may not have to end with a call to discipleship. That may have been somewhere else in the sermon. It may end with praise of God, praising God. Maybe it ends with a word about creation and what creation can teach us. So that's just another little point about doctrine that you could, but slow down. So this is helpful as you're putting a sermon together. It's also helpful as a kind of editorial thing. So one of the things you can do is look back on your sermons and go, wow, what's the text? Or did I do 3 texts? What's my theme? Can I find it? Or is there not one there? Or do I have 3 themes that I was really working on? What's the main image? Are there too many? How many missions did I have this week? It can be really helpful to look back at your sermons and kind of analyze them in that way. So it's a great it's a great editorial thing. So forget about all this. Just forget it. Write your sermon this week or next week, and then go through it with this and go, okay, what's the text? What's the theme? So on. And this will help you. And with my students, there's a lot here, and this is not easy to do, but it can become a kind of habit to look at this every week and have this as a part of your process. But with my preaching students, I usually say, just try to get 3 of these right the first time. And because you're preaching at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, it's going to be, you already have one text. I'm asking you to preach from one text. And within that, find the theme. And then the others, give me one of the others. Make sure you have either one image or one mission. And let's start there. Any questions, comments, complaints? Yes. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. The question is, do you use, Allan, do you use secondary texts? Yes. So yeah, I should have qualified that better. Yes, it does. The sermon centers around one biblical text, but of course we want to include some other texts there that support it. Often when I'm preaching on one of the gospel stories, there's something that happened before, something happened after. So you're really saying something else about the Gospel of Matthew and not just this. Yes, they can be included. And we do want to do that. Like we want to be intertextual, right? And this may connect with something from Genesis and something from Revelation, but make those brief and keep coming back to this one and preach the gospel from this one. Sometimes sermons, they have these movements where you started with this story or this biblical text, but the preacher doesn't think there's enough gospel there. So they're going to add something from Ephesians at the end. You can do that, but again, it takes away from the focus of the sermon. Thanks for that question. And I will say also that there are great ways to do topical sermons with many texts. Like I've heard that too. And I don't want to say this is a biblical. We all want to, many preachers say they want to preach biblically. And this is a biblical way, as is a topical sermon that touches on many different biblical texts. These are all biblical preaching, absolutely. But this is the kind of biblical preaching that I'm more interested in, and I think it keeps us more focused. Was there a question? Yep.
Is that what your sermon is doing?
Yeah. Let's go through them all. One biblical text. So the question you can ask is, what's the text doing? Again, you know what it's about, but what is this text doing? What's it doing here? Why is it here in this part of Paul's argument or this part of Matthew's story and not there? So what's it doing in its context? Is the story before it, story after? What's it doing here? The theme, I probably didn't say this before. A theme, Paul Scott Wilson says that a theme has to include God, Jesus, or the Spirit as the subject. God is doing, Jesus is doing. A sermon theme that's something like, we ought to be nice people, or we ought, even better, we should be good disciples. It doesn't have God in it. Like literally. Where's God? Where's Jesus? Where's the Holy Spirit? So when a theme sentence is strongest if God is doing something or Jesus is doing something. Jesus invites us to discipleship. Jesus invites us to follow. Jesus lifted her up. Right? So that's an action. That's God doing something. Doctrines move, right? Doctrines or theological faith. This is the formation process that we're working with. We have, maybe in your sermon, we have understood our theology of baptism to be this, but what about this? So there's a way of moving people along to another insight, inviting people to another insight to this common thing that we do. Image. An image is, the images I'm mentioning are not frozen. They're not a single picture. There's movement. There's movement from being bent over to being lifted up. There's movement from I don't like you to an embrace, right? There's a movement of reconciliation. So these are moving pictures. And Paul Scott Wilson talked about this, and there's another book that just came right out, and I forget the name of it, but it's follows this theme of how to make scenes in a sermon. And it's written by a preaching scholar and a movie director, right? We are playing out scenes in the minds of the hearer in our sermons, moving from the trouble, the sin, the wound, to God's grace, to the gospel. What is that movement like? What is it like emotionally? What is it like otherwise? And then one mission. Yeah, mission is movement. Right? It's about what is happening. It's a movement toward somebody. It's a movement from Jesus toward others. Let me say a word about this. On the issue of mission and discipleship, unless you've been with a church for about 5 years, don't make yourself the hero of a good discipleship story. This is the thing I did because I'm a follower of Jesus. That can work from time to time if the people really know you and you have high integrity in the situation. The best stories of mission are what I have experienced from others. Right? And I don't have to say we should be bringing meals to each other as a church when things go wrong. All I have to do is tell the story of when, and this did happen, when our 5-year-old was really sick one summer and we were overwhelmed with how our church took care of us. I don't have to say after that we should really be. And it's about me receiving something. It's not about me giving it. So that's another way to talk about discipleship. Again, discipleship is a kind of movement. It's a doing. Does that help? We're going to change everything up, folks. It is halftime, or a little bit more than halftime. And I'm going to invite you to stand up. There you go. Those are all the words you're going to see. So you can do this at home. Stand up. You don't have to stand up. You can be seated if you want. But stand up in your space so you can see me. And we're going to do some body exercises that will free your voice. And I'm going to talk about a free voice a bit later. We're going to do this. We're going to do the thing, and then we're going to talk about what we're doing afterwards. Okay. So here we go. So your feet should be shoulder length apart, roughly, and unlock your knees. Your knees should be loose. You can do a little dance. Just make sure they're loose. Your hips can be loose, and loosen your shoulders a little bit. And start with just tapping yourself to the head, waking up all those beautiful nerves, the nerve endings in your skin and underneath. Go across here. The other hand, don't forget to keep hands across your shoulders, your back. Go high up here, your belly, chest, your butt. It's your butt, your hands, do what you want. And move down one leg if you can. There you go. You may feel a little more awake. After that, you've woken up some of the endings of your nerves. And let's move to the jaw. So your palms of your hands are on your cheekbones, and I just kind of move them down. You're moving down what's called the masseter muscle, which is the muscle that helps us chew or That's the big muscle. Oh, you can vocalize that. So you're pulling your jaw down just a little bit. Oh. Oh. And just check in a little bit with your jaw. See what kind of movement you have. My jaw is really, it's harder to move. And probably it's because I watched a violent TV show last night. Like we experience anger here or tense, we get tense, any kind of tension. And so I just every day try to do this. What's my jaw? Who is my jaw today? Right? I just try to stroke down again. And then give yourself a massage or massage, as they say in England. We experience a lot of tension in our shoulders. We don't need that tension to speak. Try the other side and just let those muscles go. Feel that tension that's there. The reason we're relaxing some muscles is because vibration loves bones. The vibrations that I'm sending out right now are a combination of my breathing, of course, but the reverberations that you hear are, and this is true when you speak as well, the reverberations you hear is the vibrations bouncing off of the bones here, the bones here, and the bones of my face. And if those muscles are tense, then there's not as much vibration that will go to the bone, right? So this is why it's good to loosen yourself up a little bit in the ways that we're doing, and in this way too, just go side to side. You're just giving your muscles a bit of time to relax and let go, because the sound that will usher forth from your mouth will sound easier if you can let some muscles go. A bit of background to the Linklater work. Kristen Linklater she died 3 years ago. She was a teacher for actors and storytellers and preachers and many others for about 60 years. And she developed something called the free voice. And what she would say, no, she didn't develop it. She wrote about it and did it. She would, the purest voice, our baby has left us. We had a baby in the room here. The purest voice is the baby. The baby, the 1 month old, the 2 month old, we haven't put any societal rules on the voice yet. So when this baby feels a pang, whether that's for milk or because there's a diaper that needs changing or they need comfort, it is just, right? It's just right there. And as we get older, our voices become more socialized, and they should. Girls don't talk that way. Boys don't talk that way. Use your inside voice. Use your outside voice. Shut up, right? All of these things contribute to how we then use our voices. And every culture varies on how this works. But one of the things that happens is that we start to become kind of conventional in how we speak, and then we keep speaking that way. And then what happens is that the highs and lows are missing. The automatic reaction to stimulus also dies. And so we may feel lonely or tired, but our voice always wants to be really pleasant because that's what we're used to doing. And we have so many pastoral roles to fill that we just have to be really on top of everything and have our public face forward and so on. And so what happens to us is that It's not just psychological that we think we need to use this voice. It's also muscular. It's physiological. My jaw is used to working this way, and there's nothing I can do about it. And so one of the things that we're doing in vocal classes, the classes that I took, was to try to relax some of those muscles that are tense so that we are freer to communicate. That's a bit of background. We're going to do something else. Again, your knees are soft. This is something we're also used to, is just locking our knees. Keep them soft, your ankles soft, hips are soft. And I want you to notice your breathing. You have your mouth slightly open. In fact, you can lick your lips. Do a little pop. And then you'll notice that when you breathe in, air drops in cool, comes up warm. Air drops in cool, comes up warm. Just notice your natural breathing rhythm. The breath is the engine of the voice. Keep noticing your breathing while I'm talking. You'll notice how hard that is to do. We often sometimes stop breathing when somebody's talking. Keep noticing your breathing in and out as I say a few words. The lungs, we often see lungs on a picture of the front of a person. The lungs are actually a bit further back and down than we think. So as you're breathing, put your hand back here. You can notice that the lungs move your spine, move your back ribs. Again, the lungs go further back and down than we think. The other thing you can notice, put your hand on your belly, just above your navel. And notice that when you breathe in, your stomach expands and gets smaller again. And if you're not feeling that, be more aware as you breathe in to breathe lower. Most of us in North America are chest breathers. So when you ask somebody to take a breath, they go, I exaggerated that slightly. But there is some movement up there. Try to bring that movement down to your belly so that you can feel when you inhale. Now, your lungs aren't right there. What's happening is that your lungs are expanding and it's pushing down your organs, which pushes them out. So another step to this, which is so much fun and kind of intimate, is let your gut go. We spend so much time in our society holding our guts in for all kinds of aesthetic reasons, whatever, right? Let it go. This may be something for your body that's a very foreign experience. In fact, when I try to do this in my kitchen, when I'm making supper or just going for a walk, try to be mindful of letting my gut go. I can sometimes start to feel nauseous. Why? Because my body is panicking. Because I'm so used to holding it in. So the breath is the engine of the voice. It's breathing that is the engine of my voice. So that's so much so that the whole time, or most of the time that I'm talking to you, I am not visualizing myself here. I'm here. This is me. This is how I'm communicating to you from my gut. Not my face is involved, but the moments of communication that really seem to work for me is when I'm communicating from here, the center of appetites and desires and the pang that I felt as a baby when I needed milk or comfort or something like that. We're going to do one more thing. I said before that our body is resonating. We want vibrations to find bones. And this is an experimental way to do this. So put your hands on your chest, look up. This is just a, oh. Try that. Oh, keep your knees loose. Oh. Oh. You feel those bones. Oh, the bones, right? And now just look forward like you're looking at your friends in the room, or you're looking eye level. Hey, 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 hey. Hey, 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 hey. Hey, 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 hey. Now put your fingers here. Dig them in just a little bit. Hey, 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 hey. You feel the vibration. There is a beautiful bone that goes right from here all the way back. And there's a little space there for your optical nerve and all the other things that are connecting the brain and the rest of your body. But otherwise, there's a beautiful bone there that you want to vibrate. And this has been a great correction for me because I have this voice that always wants to go down at the end of a sentence, right? And what happens is that I'm talking back here. Everything's back here. We want as much as we can to move our voices forward. And one of the ways to do that is experiment with the vibrations that you feel right here. Ma, 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 ma. Feel that? Ma, 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 ma. You feel those vibrations there? Ha. And then one more, and that is so you're, again, your knees are soft. You're looking at a space on the floor about a meter or a yard in front of you. So it's going to be a 3-inch difference for Canadians and Americans. He, 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 he. He, 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 he. And try to imagine that the air that is coming up, your exhale is going right to your front teeth. He, 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 he. And then back up to looking eye level. Hey, 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 hey. Ah. So those are your vibrations. And I could do a lot more of this, and maybe we'll do this another time. I did about 400 hours of this work to qualify to be a Linklater voice teacher. And I do this with congregations. I do this with my preaching students. I teach a voice class. Of course, we do half of the storytelling class that I teach is this kind of work. So the voice is a full body instrument. There's a number of different places you can read about this. Nancy Lammers-Gross, for instance. Nancy Lammers-Gross, for instance, has a really good book on women's voices in preaching, and I think that's actually what it's called. And then there are a number of other chapters. I'm going to send out a bibliography of more books you can read if you're interested. So what I want to say to you, and this is for me too, because it's a constant struggle, and that is, when you're preaching, we want to hear you. We want to hear your voice preaching, not somebody else's voice, and not the voice that you think you need to preach. We live in a world of cadences. And by cadence, I mean like the musical way that people talk. It goes up and it goes down, it goes around. And we hear different kinds of cadences in different areas of life. For instance, news anchors have a certain kind of cadence to the way they talk. Reporting live from Elkhart, Indiana, right? There's a kind of, yeah, I'm not going to try to describe it. You know what it is. Like, just watch the evening news and you'll see how this is done. And there are a few news anchors on TikTok and other places who are reporting from their home sometimes just for fun. And there's my daughter and she's at the fridge again, right? So, and then you get to hear this disconnect, or it starts to become comedy when you start narrating, little bits of life with a sound from somewhere else. And the different tour guides have a cadence too. And to your left, you'll see the Empire State Building, right? So, that was a high-pitched version of it, but there's a kind of and to your left, there's a kind of that goes along with it. And there's also a pastoral care voice, and I'm not even, we'll talk about the preacher's pastoral care voice, but I'm talking more about larger situations like Bill Clinton, Hillary, Obama. I don't hear it much from Trump, but when something bad happens, all of a sudden there's a really kind of smooth pastoral voice that comes from our leaders, who are really aware of the hard things that are happening and are using a voice very much like that. One of my voice teachers in Toronto, David Smuckler, who's I think 80 or 81 now, I took voice classes from him years ago, and he was a regular teacher of acting and voice at York University, but he also had a lot of private clients. And he had a lot of actors and storytellers and preachers who came to him for voice lessons. And he said he could always, when he got to know I was a preacher, he said, yeah, I always know the preachers that I have, I always know when they come in and they've done a funeral that week. Because their jaws are just set out a little bit further, and they've got this kind of mellifluous, caring voice, right? He was exaggerating slightly, but he could hear that just so closely. And one of the things that I try to do in my voice work with students, and I encourage you to do, is to notice the cadences that you're using when you're preaching. And there is a kind of preacher voice out there, and it's different in different denominations, in different regions of the world, and so on, and different languages. But do start to register and notice the cadences that are being used in your setting or other settings, and in your own voice. As soon as you stand up, what does your voice sound like? And is it your natural voice, or are you putting some kind of cadence to it that you think you need to have, as a preacher, right? So I got nailed on this by Kristen Linklater when I was studying with her about 7 years ago. And she's short and she's Scottish, and this is important for the story. And I think I'd been to her studio for about 3 days, and we still really hadn't used a lot of words yet. It was a lot of vocal sounds and a lot of exercises on the floor to loosen up various parts of the body and get those vibrations going and so on. And she wanted to listen to each of us. There were 7 of us in this class. She wanted to listen to each of us sigh. And the sigh is a big deal in the voice world because a sigh is a breath that has a thought feeling connected to it. Like when you get to the end of the day and you sit in your favorite chair, like it's a breath, but it has incredible meaning. It's got emotion in it, right? Or you go to the doctor and you find out that you may have cancer, and then you find out from the doctor that you don't. There's a sigh. And notice how much we sigh. We sigh a lot every day. Anyways, we were doing sighs and a full sort of unmitigated sigh. And so I sighed kind of like this. It was my turn. And she was like, we were in a circle. She was in the middle looking up at us. So she's looking up at me and I just do this. She looks up at, Allan, you're lying. And I go, what? Oh, Allan, your sigh is just the way you expect me to hear. You're sighing like a preacher. Like you're starting out high and you're ending out low because you want that profound end of the sentence. And then she had me sigh. So she said, okay, no, I want you to sigh. Allan Rudy-Froese, you. You're not a preacher right now. You're a guy standing here, and I want you to sigh. No. And I started, and it took me 7 times before she said, okay, fine. I'm starting to hear you, but we're going to work on this, right? So a genuine, heartfelt, gut-felt, feeling sigh is what she was working at. But she got me to thinking a lot about the cadences that I typically use in preaching and the cadences that I'm used to in life. So I have a line here, and the Lord led the people out of Egypt. So there you go. It's a beautiful line, kind of innocuous maybe. No, it isn't. But so the cadence that I sometimes hear that we expect to say when we're preaching is, and the Lord led the people out of Egypt, right? Like it's big, it starts a little higher, goes down at the end, and the Lord led the people out of Egypt. That's a bit of a caricature. And of course, the caricatures abound with this. I mean, Monty Python and any comedy group before and after are constantly playing with the cadences of preachers, right? There's a really good sermon by Robin Cook and Dudley Moore. My brother Esau is an hairy man, but I am a smooth man. So that's the thing. And actually, it's a great sermon for image and repetition because it keeps coming back to that, but for no reason, right? And when my life is at an end and I think, oh, I just want to shove it, I think, my brother Esau is an hairy man, but I am a smooth man. So yeah, it means nothing and everything. And actually, C.S. Lewis's mother, when she was 18, around the turn of the century, the last one, I think it's the late 1800s, her dad was an Anglican priest, and she was listening to sermons all the time, and she wrote a sermon, and we don't have a recording of it, but she wrote a parody sermon, Old Mother Hubbard. And the text was Old Mother Hubbard, and it's just hilarious. Just look up I can't remember her name, C.S. Lewis's mother, Old Mother Hubbard, and you'll find the sermon. But so this can be the butt of a lot of jokes. But a line like this, so I did the proclamation, and the Lord led the people out of Egypt, right? There's this kind of, one of the things I ask preachers to do is, but how would you, not the preacher, but how do you say this, right? And it's actually kind of difficult to do. to actually sound like yourself when you're up here, because so much of our education and so much of experience has suggested that somehow when we get behind a pulpit, we have to read things in a certain way. And of course, the scripture's read like this too, right? Normally, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But we get to the church and it's like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? There's a different kind of, we feel like we have to read the Bible in a certain way. And we don't. There are more natural ways to do this. So what I do with my students is we sit down and I ask them to give me a line from their sermon as just like we're sitting at the coffee shop, right? Informal, right? So how would you say, and the Lord led the people out of Egypt, right? How would you say that to your buddies, at the coffee shop, to your friends, sitting the glass of wine or something? How do you do that, right? And it'd be kind of like, so I'm going to look at you, Joe. So the Lord led the people out of Egypt, right? That's the coffee shop. And then there's the preacher voice. And we really want something that's kind of in the middle of that for the sermon. My voice up here is a bit different than the one I use with Joe or with Marisa or with others in the room here when we're in conversation. And this is kind of a natural thing that happens. I'm in a room this size, this many people, there you are all online. And my gestures will become bigger here than they will be with Joe when we're talking. And if this room were even bigger, I'd probably just naturally have bigger gestures. So there's natural kind of things that happen, but there's so many things that you can do with this sentence. Again, how would you say it naturally? And it's hard to do because, yeah. And the Lord led the people out of Egypt. I don't know if that was great, but what I did is I decided to go up at the end rather than down. So that's one way to practice this, is to notice which of the sentences where I'm always going down at the end to be profound and theological. And one of the problems with that is that we may not be able to hear you, right? I get this a lot from people who know that I teach preaching. They say, I can't hear the preacher. And it's not because of the acoustical system, the electronic system. It could be and it could be because you're talking back here somewhere and it's hard to hear you. But it could also be that you're going down at the end of sentences and we can't actually hear you. This happens a little bit too much at the seminary, especially with men. Young men who think they have all the theological chops in the world. And they're like, so yeah, like Karl Barth, like he really nailed it when he finally came to, and you don't hear the end of it because it's trying to be so low and profound. So play with this is what I would say. And one of the things that you'll notice when you start playing with this is that, like, we're spending a lot of energy trying to sound like a preacher sometimes, if this is an issue for you. We're spending a lot of time, and it's not the usual cadences that we use, so we're spending a lot of time just doing this, right? And while that feels kind of natural for you up here, you're spending a lot of energy doing that. But what you may find if you start to use your own voice to preach is that you're going to start to feel a lot more vulnerable. Because this is actually now me talking to you in a voice that I use every day to some extent. And you'll notice a kind of new vulnerability. So what Kristen Linklater was doing was saying, the voice reveals and conceals, right? And what she was saying to me was that I'm actually concealing myself. You're hiding. Allan, you're hiding behind your voice. You don't want to be vulnerable. You don't want to actually communicate your own emotion And again, I'm not talking about big emotions, your own vulnerability, your own woundedness, et cetera, et cetera. Any questions about this aspect of, I know this might be new for some of you, and I look at this very holistically so that it's not like you work on a sermon, and then there's delivery at the end. No, your body is involved in all of this. And you can actually get your body involved more in this by, right when you start working on your sermon, reading it out loud. Get those vibrations into your body. Nazareth, Cana, right? And you can even play a little game with yourself. And I know this isn't great exegesis, but what's your favorite word? Nazareth, wine, Cana, right? What's your favorite word? And it may lead to something and it may not. But starting to get the vibrations of the words, the nouns, the verbs in your body early in the week will help your body know what to do with them when you get to the pulpit. And recognizing that you're using your whole body the whole time when you're preparing. You're sitting, that's using your body. You're standing. And I find one of the things that I've found in preaching, because us preachers are so verbal, most of us, when I get stuck in a sermon, so I'm writing a sermon, and I get stuck, what am I going to do next? I know where I'm going, but what's the middle part here? I just stand up and start preaching it, what I have, and then usually that part comes. It's like, what do I say? That's what I say next, right? And maybe that'll change again, right? Any questions or comments about this vocal stuff? Yes.
I think you know where you're headed, and even, you know.
Yeah.
This new person who's with you, maybe like stops you in the middle of a sentence and doesn't know where you're going with it or the translation, you know, correct, but it just, it breaks it up.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Yeah, just a comment here that the translation, preaching and somebody else translating, has a way of, it's hard to keep the energy going. It's a different kind of preaching. Yeah. I've only done one sermon like that, which was really interesting. So you do that all the time, or that happens more than often. Yeah.
And break this up so that while we're waiting.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah. And it really depends on the translator too. Like, are they catching that emotion? Or are they doing it in a different way? Yeah. Yeah. Was there a question back there?
Just I guess I'm looking for tips, and maybe it's these breathing exercises of how do you find like your voice, your cadence, right? I think what I find myself doing is imitating like the cadence of the podcaster I'm listening to that week or something,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
And I don't know if there's value in playing around with imitation or if that's just like a cop out and concealing myself.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, I think there's all kinds of things to do. Like, play around with try to imitate different cadences that you hear. And you just sort of become more aware of the different ways that people talk in different situations. And Yeah, I mean, one thing you can do is to try to do a sermon with the people in the room or not. And, you know, one of my students this year was working on this, and all she did is said to herself, talking to the people. I'm talking to my congregation. Instead of I'm preaching. Now, that might be different for everybody else, but when she did that, the whole room changed, in my estimation. Because now we were hearing her and not some thing she thought she needed to some way that she thought she needed to speak. I have this later, but yeah, take an improv class, take an acting class. And just to be clear, all this acting classes, voice classes for actors, storytellers, and so on, this is not to teach you about acting, although maybe that's a byproduct. One of the most essential things that actors have to do is feel. And they have to know their own natural voice and what it does and what it doesn't do. And they have to communicate emotion. No, they don't have to communicate emotion. They have to be in touch with how they're communicating the emotion of an event. So really, it's about knowing yourself and your own voice. So that if I'm playing Hamlet, that's a lofty idea. If I'm playing Hamlet, I mean, one of the kind of unwritten things, well, it is written, I have to be 100% me and 100% Hamlet. Yeah, fully God and fully human. This is one of the places where Christian theology and the theater meet, and there's actually lots of good articles about that, right? There's a whole thing called theater theology, which I follow, which is theologians and actors and directors and theater people talking to each other. Not to say that the theater people aren't Christian. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But and some of the theologians are actors. So you get these really interesting conversations. But acting courses helped me be me more than anything else. And voice courses do the same. Voice classes are scary, and acting and improv courses will be scary because we want you to reveal more of you. You can't act unless you reveal more of you. And that's hard to do. And I mean, the times in voice classes or acting classes where people burst into tears because they have either discovered something about their body or themselves, or been reminded of something that happened in the past, or realizing they've been covering up something their whole life. And now it's vocalized and they can say it. I realize our time is going here. I'm going to just mention a few more things. We didn't even get to talk about sermon form. Oh my goodness. All I'm going to do is direct you to sermon form is, you start over here, and then you go here, and then you go here, and then you go, and you're finished. The sermon, right? It's the different components of, it's how you're moving in a sermon. And I just will recommend to you Wesley O. Allen's Determining the Form. It's a short book. It's inexpensive. It's 90 pages, and it brilliantly goes through a number of different sermon forms, older historical forms and newer kinds of forms, ways to put the sermon together. And I mean, just to be very brief about this, we've moved from propositional verse by verse sermons. Most of the sermons I hear are narrative in a broad sense. They start with a problem. It's like the TV shows we watch or the mystery novels you read. It starts off with a problem, with a conflict, with a wound, and how are we going to solve it? Is it this? No. How about no? Is it? Oh, there it is, right? And somehow the sermon lands in good news that deals with the problems or sins or conflicts that were there at the beginning. That is a really short view of narrative preaching. Next steps, listen to sermons, read sermons. Listen to and reread your own sermons and think about the tiny dog now is mine. And what is the form and what is the cadence that you're using? And yeah, what is this sermon doing? Or is it doing too many things? Enroll in an acting and improv course. I just talked about that. And embrace the struggle, folks. This is hard work. Writing to begin with is hard work. Some of us find it harder than others. And Barbara Brown Taylor, by the way, is really good at helping us write. And the struggle you're feeling to come up with that theme, to preach this sermon, you're even feeling hypocritical. You're having all kinds of feels about this sermon. And there's some anxiety about it. There's how do I even resolve this in a way? How do I communicate this? That struggle is good. Because if you are wrestling with the text, you can help your congregation wrestle with the same issues. I'm going to end there, and maybe there's some more questions. We are almost at time here, aren't we?
A question from the online folks. Where or when do these vocal or body preparatory techniques fit within the structure of Sunday worship?
Where do they fit into the structure of Sunday worship? Not sure exactly what the question is, but like I do these kind of vocal exercises. I did them this morning before I came. I do them a Sunday morning. I usually do like a 10 to 15 to 20 minute vocal body warm up. Includes some really bizarre stretches on the floor that look like yoga and other things. Get your voices ready for what you're going to do. I also lead Bible studies where we do these kinds of exercises, and then we get into a biblical text. Is that the question you think it is? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think so. Or, is there value in bringing some of these techniques to the congregation? I think maybe as well.
Well, I mean, I've been in a number of different settings where the preacher simply asks people to breathe. Simply asks. It's a huge thing, actually. To have us notice our breath is to have us connected with life in a new way. One of the things that we have in worship that's beautiful and that some actor friends of mine have talked about that is really good is we sing. We stand and we sing. And that singing is doing a lot for us. Right? There's a lot of vibrations happening there. If we know the song, and we might be moving to it, singing is actually just a great warm up for what we're going to do in the rest of the service. I don't want to say singing is just that at all, but there are all kinds of great things that are happening in our bodies when we sing. Yeah, preachers that I like or some to avoid. Yeah, that's a dangerous question, that one. Yeah, and I mean, I love Nadia Bolz-Weber, her preaching. She's very direct, and the thought, feelings are just right out in front. It's almost, she's very vulnerable. I love her too because she's so conservatively Lutheran. Like, she's actually a kind of reincarnation of Luther. Like a bit crazy and bombastic, but boy, the theology is so deep. It's such a deep theology of grace that she just embodies this. Anna Carter Florence, I think, is a great preacher. She's written books. You can read sermons and hear sermons from her on YouTube and so on. One of my friends is the dean of Duke Chapel, so Duke University, Duke Divinity School. And check out Emory as well as Duke. They have chapels and they have regular preachers there. Like I think they have a worship service there at least once a week where there's somebody actually preaching, and they bring in some really good preachers. So take a look at that. They have decades. Well, I know that Duke has decades of sermons. So you can watch sermons from the 70s with all those weird glasses and whatever, yeah, the fashions people used to wear. One of the things that I want to do is, so one of my questions is, what is Anabaptist preaching? What is Mennonite preaching? Almost everything I've said today is highly Protestant, right? Most of my sources are good Protestant preaching. The Presbyterians and Methodists really have a corner on this when it comes to homiletical literature, like the preaching books that we use and so on. What's Anabaptist preaching? So I am imagining that AMBS, probably AMBS, yeah, can we gather, curate is the cool term these days. A repository, a place where we can see what Anabaptist sermons look like, because I'm not sure I know what it is. I mean, the default is you can say, well, we preach how to follow Jesus and justice and stuff. Well, yes, we do, but there's a lot more to it than that. And if you start, and if Anabaptist means rural India, as well as, Elkhart, Indiana, and Washington, D.C., and Jakarta, then this really has to expand what we think of as Anabaptist preaching. So that's a dream, to gather videos, audio, and scripts, manuscripts. Yes, there is a book called Anabaptist Preaching, a conversation between pulpit, pew, and Bible. I think it's about 20 years old, and it's good. There's some good things there. Somebody needs to write a new one. Maybe me. I am writing an article soon, but I think it's going to be one of those, right? Towards a theology or a picture of Anabaptist preaching. I don't know. Yeah. Because almost all the good things we can do, well, we have to settle on this, that it's not distinctive in a way. Sometimes we talk about Anabaptists being really distinct. Yeah, I don't know about that with preaching, because so for instance, the communal hermeneutics that we could talk about actually for me comes from Anna Carter Florence, not from Mennonites. She's the one who's been working on communal hermeneutics for preaching. And preaching, another Anabaptist thing we might say, is preaching to uplift the community. I heard a sermon recently that preached to the church, not so much to individuals, but to the church. We could say that's a good Anabaptist sermon. And this particular preacher was a Mennonite, but most of the good literature on that comes from mainline Protestants. What are we doing? I think we're gonna end this experience. Come on, Eric.
Yeah, we're a couple minutes past 12 o'clock Eastern, but thank you, Allan, for sharing with us. I think the through line for all of us is, how do we continue to communicate the good news and work Christ in our world? And so we all need refreshers from time to time on that. So thanks again to Allan. Blessings to each of you within your ministry settings and as you continue to communicate. to your congregations and to the broader world. Thanks.